Welcome to today's episode. This is a concept that I do much with in my life, and it's something that's somewhat obvious, but needs to be extrapolated, understood, and really followed to its T because it's so easy to deviate. And we're going to discuss how and where such deviation happens. Anyway, welcome, and let's begin. The concept is activating consciousness and domestication. All right, so these are big words, but let's assume that we use the presumption of consciousness, and therefore, whatever we assume is consciousness, activating that consciousness in a localized realm. Right, so that's the concept that we're going to be discussing. So let's take a deep dive into the mind, memory, and the constructs that govern our daily existence. In this episode, we'll be exploring a rather complex and abstract concept: the activation of consciousness in the context of domestication. Now, when I speak of domestication, I'm referring to the ways in which human consciousness is shaped and at times constrained by societal structures, rituals, and media. The question we're asking: how does one activate consciousness when it feels severed from its natural expansive rumination process? It's normal for an individual to want to follow consciousness on their own, right? To be a consciousness embodiment, to experience the vitality that comes along with consciousness. And yet, fairly most of us are in domesticated lives. So then how do we reclaim that which has been domesticated, right? Once it's domesticated, it's lost the connection to the broader picture, the composite picture. At the heart of this inquiry, there are two primary pathways to activating consciousness. These are not straightforward. They are intertwined, complex, and often paradoxical. Let's break them down. There are fundamentally two ways in which one can access or activate consciousness when removed from the flow of habitual rumination. While one's participating in real-time and live structural or conceptual consciousness, participating in the environment as a whole, this is not a discussion for them. It is rather when one's away from such locales. The first pathway, recreating consciousness, suggests that consciousness can be reconstructed or activated as if civilization itself were starting anew from this individual alone. Imagine for a moment that you're the first individual in a newly established society, and you must now participate in the foundational building blocks. The process is akin to accessing memory traces of a previous state of consciousness, all without directly knowing the details of its origin. These memory traces are more than simple memories. They are echoes, fragments, reverberations of something once lived, something you thought might never fully access. The challenge here is that there are traces that are never pure. We're always working with echoes of the past. Any activation is going to follow a memory, and a memory is constructed, it's recalibrated, it's an echo. And these echoes are colored by both time and perception. In attempting to recreate consciousness, we are fundamentally trying to reconstruct something that is already lost, already fragmented, and yet it is within these fragmentation that the potential for creation lies. This is why the recreation of consciousness, all through appealing, is always a form of recreation. It is never truly new, but a remaking of something already gone. When we go to our past and we activate it in present moment, it's always going to be considered some form of recreation. So that's the first pathway. The second pathway, participating in the memory of consciousness. And it's much simpler, yet in some ways more disruptive. This approach doesn't aim to recreate consciousness. Instead, it focuses on simply engaging with the memory of it. By stepping into the memory, you are participating in the traces of consciousness which have already been established. But here's the catch. This method demands a certain detachment from the full structure of domesticated life. You are not fully immersed in the world. You are hovering above, engaging with its memories rather than its direct lived experience. This disruption of direct participation has consequences. It creates a dissonance between the memory of consciousness and the lived experience within a domesticated life. For instance, when we revisit old rituals or memories, we don't necessarily recreate them in a pure sense. We are reinterpreting them, filtering them through our current domesticated mindset. The results are paradoxical. We are not fully present within the ritual or the structure, but instead we are engaging with it from a detached vantage point. And this can sometimes skew our perception and disrupt the coherence of the domesticated order. Now let's turn our attention to rituals. They offer a fascinating case study in how consciousness can be activated, all through structural participation. Rituals are often seen as a way to recreate or reconnect with past forms of consciousness. However, in some cases, they can act as an inception of consciousness itself, a form of awakening rather than reawakening. Notice that religious frameworks use such concepts as awakening, different verses, different terms, but the idea of a renewal. Emphasis on the newal part, not the re part. For instance, consider the role of rituals for individuals in an infantile state of consciousness. These individuals, often unaware of the broader universal consciousness, experience the ritual not as a recreation of something, right? A child doesn't see it like that, but as a new activation of consciousness in their present moment. The child at the Christmas tree, that's a new activation. They're not relying on memory traces for that. It's a real embodied experience that has no broader environment to influence it. It is an inception of something that feels fresh, immediate, and vital. They don't know it yet, but they are tapping into a higher state of awareness, all by participating in the ritual. But this changes. As individuals grow and their consciousness expands, they find out Santa's not real. They broaden. It is not the fact that they found out something that they've experienced is not real, but rather they've seen something more real. As we mature and our awarenesses broaden, rituals start to feel more like recreations, and in this shift, they lose some of their original power. They no longer activate consciousness in the same way, and thank God they don't. Instead, they merely reactivate past states, reducing the potential for growth. It is a subtle but important shift from inception to recreation. The irony is then, rituals can both activate and inhibit consciousness, depending on where you are in your personal journey. Those who have expanded beyond the ritualistic framework, they may find themselves stuck in a loop, unable to transcend the boundaries of what the ritual can offer. They've outgrown the ritual, or they have outgrown the memory traces that the ritual is dependent upon, or is contextualized to perform. We'll talk about that in a second. They may become more detached from the present moment, engaging with the ritual only because it is an expected rather than a deeply activating mode. We've spent a lot of time talking about rituals in the traditional sense, but what about the more modern rituals? Specifically, let's look at social media and news consumption, or I call it socialized media consumption. It's consumption, it's media, it's a form of conceptual conduit to yourself. And it's socialized. It's only the relevant material that participates in the socialized realm. Two areas of our lives that have become increasingly ritualized in recent years. Could these two function as the forms of embodiment and experience, and therefore as vehicles for recreating consciousness? Absolutely. In fact, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of contemporary life. Engaging with live media, for instance, whether through a live stream event, breaking news, real-time social media engagement, all can act in a manner similar to traditional rituals. When you engage with the media in a ritualistic fashion, you are essentially participating in an embodied experience. You're not simply watching the event, you are living it. In some sense, through the shared consciousness of the collective. This is where the potential for recreation of conscious arises. When you engage with these forms of media, you're participating in a real-time social event, and in doing so, you're activating certain memory traces of consciousness. You're not just consuming content. You're becoming part of the moment in a shared collective way. However, these shared experiences come along with the danger. As with any ritual, the more ritualized your engagement, the more you risk being domesticated by the experience. The experience ceases to be an active expansion of consciousness and instead becomes a reinforcement of pre-existing consciousness memory traces. This is where things get tricky. Socialized media consumption can either become the expansion of consciousness or a narrowing of it, depending on how we engage with it. If we treat media purely as a form of entertainment or passive consumption, it remains inert, but when we engage with it in a deeply ritualized way, it can recreate our consciousness by activating collective memory traces. Here's where things get truly paradoxical. The more we engage with localized, socialized media, live events, for instance, news consumption, all in a ritualized manner, the more we risk reinforcing our domesticated state. These forms of media consumption, if ritualized, have the power to recreate our consciousness, but they also domesticate it. Instead of allowing consciousness to expand and flow freely, we are anchoring ourselves into a localized or fragmented sense of reality. Not only that, we're disrupting the ability to see the world at large for more than how we've actualized the world from our domesticated, localized realm. And so we're completely severing our relationship to the true reality in order to recreate reality in our localized realm. This narrow framework becomes our reality. It keeps us from accessing the broader spectrum of consciousness, which lies beyond the immediate domesticated experience. In essence, the ritualized consumption of socialized media becomes a microcosm of our larger societal structure. It's a dosage. It's a copy. It keeps us rooted in the domestic social sphere, all while blocking access to higher, broader forms of consciousness. This can create a profound dissonance as our individual consciousness becomes increasingly constrained by the rituals of our media consumption, much like the rituals of ancient traditions, which can constrain the individual from accessing broader universal consciousness, which already remains in their memory traces. It is not the individual that hasn't accessed that yet, because then there's no recreation, because there was no original creation to be recreated. It is rather only the individual that already has the attainment through whatever their experiences are to broader, more serious, more vital consciousness that then goes back into these rituals and recreates them in these narrow, localized realms. So how do we break free from this cycle? The challenge is to activate consciousness in a way that isn't dependent on ritualized forms of memory recreation, again, according to the individual level. For if there's no broader memory traces, then this would be the opportune moment of creation, like the child with Santa. Whether through traditional rituals or the modern rituals of media consumption, the key is to engage consciously with these practices to ensure they don't trap us in a loop of domestication. Rather than being passively swept along with the current, we must recognize when our engagement is a ritualized element, where we're embodying the experience. And as I've noted, live events, it's almost impossible not to embody, because there's such a ritualized experience to it. We need high levels of contextual, layers that, like, there's a reason why I'm doing this. I'm participating in this, nothing for the effect of this embodiment, but rather I'm doing a research I'm studying the system. But the second we engage in the embodiment, and also I've noted that the secondary most primary embodiment is news consumption, because it is socialized, it is relevant to the moment, and it's an experience that reaches to embodiment in its almost natural way. We must recognize when our engagement is with rituals, whether old or new. Is it truly expanding our consciousness, and when it is simply reinforcing and recreating consciousness? And this awareness, we find the freedom to activate higher forms of consciousness in its proper realm outside of domestication, to engage with the world in a more expansive, dynamic way, rather than remaining stuck in the patterns of domestication, which shapes so much of our everyday lives. Thank you for joining me today as we explore consciousness, domestication, rituals which shape our mind. Until next time, remember, consciousness is always in flux, always evolving, and it's up to you how you engage with it. Enjoy.